Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Insha'Allah ta'ala, we want to just quickly recap what we've covered thus far from the book in section 1 and section 2, especially as section 2 had a lot of ayat that we read through and discussed. So we don't want to forget the principles that we learned in section 1 of the book, wherein the author rahimahullah wrote his introduction and then put some important principles in order to understand what came in those ayat, and also what he will mention in section 3 from the different ahadith. So the author rahimahullah started with his introduction, and in the introduction he discussed the beliefs of a Muslim, the iman of a Muslim, and he began by listing the 6 pillars of iman. And we're not going to cover everything like we did in the lesson, but just some of the main key points bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So he went on to say, after mentioning the 6 pillars, he went on to say, with regards to the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, from iman in Allah is to have iman in the way that Allah described himself in his book and the way that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam described Allah, without distortion and negation or rejection, and without asking or likening Allah to something else. Rather, they, i.e. the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, believe that for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there is nothing like unto him, and he is as-Sami' al-Basir. So from here we understood that belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's perfect names and lofty attributes has 2 foundations, and they were found in the ayah لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There is nothing like unto him, and he is as-Sami', the all-hearer, the one who has perfect hearing, as-Sami', the all-seeing, the one who has perfect seeing. And as you can see, the first part from the ayah is in white, and the second part is in yellow, in both the Arabic and then in the translation of the meaning. And from these 2 we understood these 2 foundations. Number 1, negation, and number 2, affirmation, and nafyu wal ithbat, and they are color-coded to correspond to where they occur in the ayah. And then the author also highlighted for us that negation has to be free from 2 things. Has to be free from 2 things. So negation without tahrif, distortion, and it has to be negation that does not have ta'atil, rejection. And we went on to discuss the fact that distortion can occur in either wording, so someone can change distortion, i.e. to change. They can either change the wording. So for example, if we had this sentence in English, the pen is red, changing that or distorting that in wording would mean that we would say now the pen is yellow. And we said that the connection between tahrif and ta'atil is that tahrif leads to ta'atil. Distortion, when you change something, it leads to rejecting the original meaning. So now if we look at the second sentence where we say the pen is yellow, a person who holds that will end up having rejected the first or the original statement, the pen is red. So once they've changed it to yellow, they will reject the fact that the pen is red. Or this distortion can also occur in the meaning that is given. So one way of distorting is that the change is made in wording, or the change may be made in meaning. So for example, if we have the sentence now, the pen is red, and then someone says the pen is red. Now the second sentence, although it has the same wording, if the person now changes and says, okay, the word red does no longer mean red as in the first sentence, but the word red actually means yellow. So the wording is the same, but they have distorted the actual meaning. And so sometimes in the topic of Allah's names and attributes, you find that some of the those who had deviated, at times they try to change the harakat and at times they changed the meaning. So they kept the wording, but they changed the meaning of the word. They said, oh, this word doesn't mean this, but it means something else. So the author rahimahullah ta'ala is highlighting for us that negation has to be free from distortion, and it has to be free from rejection. And then the second foundation that the author brought from the ayah was affirmation, where Allah affirmed that He is As-Sami' Al-Basir. And affirmation has to be free from two things as well, and they are takyif, and that is to specify a howness, and affirmation has to be free from tamthil, and that is to specify a howness by giving an example. So the connection between these two is also very clear, because specifying a howness to an attribute or to a name, for example, and then giving it a similitude. So you're specifying it, and then you're going the further step of comparing it to something, giving an example for it. So affirmation has to be free from takyif, specifying a howness, and tamthil, giving or specifying a howness by giving an example. Then the author rahimahullah ta'ala in another part of the introduction gave us 5 principles, and they are found in this part of the author's introduction. So he mentioned that they do not negate, Ahl Sunnah do not negate what he was described with. فَلَا يَنْفُونَ عَنْهُ مَا وَصَفَ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ. So they do not negate from Allah what He described Himself with. وَلَا يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَنْ مَوَاضِعِهِ. And nor do they distort the wording from their proper places. وَلَا يُلْحِدُونَ فِي أَسْمَاءِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَآيَاتِهِ. And they do not blaspheme, or we can say they do not deviate, they do not make ilhad against the names of Allah, nor against His ayat. وَلَا يُكَيِّفُونَ. And they do not ascribe a modality, or they do not ascribe a certain howness, they do not specify a howness. وَلَا يُمَثِّلُونَ صِفَاتِهِ بِصِفَاتِ خَلْقِهِ. And they do not give examples or strike parables or give examples, compare His attributes to the attributes of His creation. So those are the 5 principles, and then he went on to give us why those principles are in place. For He subhanahu wa ta'ala has no likeness, no comparison, and no partner. Nor is He measurable in analogy with His creation, i.e. nor can you make qiyas, can you make analogy between the creation and between Allah, such that you could derive things. Indeed, He knows Himself best as well as everything else, and He is the most truthful in speech, the best in address to His creation. The best in address to His creation, i.e. He is truthful in speech, and He is most able to convey what He wants to say, or what He wanted to convey. Thus, His messengers are truthful and affirm the truth, differing from those who speak of what they do not know. So from here we get 5 principles. Number 1, that Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah do not negate for Allah what He has described Himself with. Secondly, they do not distort the wording from its rightful place. They do not make tahrif. Number 3, they do not make ilhad, they do not deviate in regards to His names and His ayat. Number 4, they do not ascribe a howness or a modality to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number 5, they do not compare His attributes to the attributes of His creation. So those are the 5 things that the author rahimahullah, 5 principles that he brought forth. And then he went on to say 2 reasons for those 5 principles, and they were wherein the author rahimahullah mentioned, because Allah has no one similar, no comparable, and no partner, wherein he says لأنه سبحانه وتعالى لا سمي له ولا كفو له ولا ند له. And then he went on to say, nor is an analogy with his creation possible. Glory be to him, the exalted. ولا يقاس بخلقه سبحانه وتعالى. And the second reason that the author mentioned is found in the other part of his statement, that his messengers are truthful and entrusted, wherein he said, ثُمَّ رُسُلُهُ صَادِقُونَ مُصَدَّقُونَ. So the information that they, the messengers, convey regarding him, regarding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is correct. And their way was to combine between negation and affirmation. So those are the main things that we need to try to remember, to try to get our head around. And then as the ayat or a hadith I mentioned, we remember that what the author rahimahullah ta'ala has clarified for us from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.